Good afternoon. In our recent series on the will of God, we discussed God's intended will so we could understand God's intent for all creation. We ended that series with God's ultimate will, which assures us that in the end, God and His goodness will ultimately reign in heaven, where sin, evil, pain, and brokenness are finally and forever gone. Between those two realities, which is where we live every day, we covered two critical biblical and theological topics that relate directly to the will of God. First, we discussed God's will for man's will in order to better understand humanity's free will to choose. We then discussed God's intervening will and how that intervention has at times altered, adjusted, and interrupted man's will, and even things like natural laws put in place with creation. Easter is the prime example of such an interruption. But those four areas of God's will are so vast that even though we've covered them, there's at least one major question that remains. What does God's goodness and God's good will have to say about bad things or about bad people, especially when those things or those people hurt good people and God people? Well, some writers found this question so difficult that they have either discounted or written off completely the miracles of the Old and New Testaments. This helps them to logically conclude that God never was and never will be active in human history. For them, biblical stories like Moses and the Red Sea, Daniel's lion's den or the fiery furnace, Hezekiah's tunnel, and all the New Testament stories of miraculous healings are little more than fairy tales. For this group, unless God intervenes every time we experience pain or injustice, unless God does step in to right every wrong, they must conclude that God never has and never will intervene. Although very few Christians would go so far as to dismiss all miracles of Scripture, you can appreciate how they do complicate the question of why doesn't God intervene in my situation and perform a miracle for me when I ask Him to. Now, other writers went in a different direction to explain why God intervenes in some instances but not others. John Calvin and others like him used biblical words like predestination to explain how everything across creation is happening according to God's plan and purpose, and that God is part of and responsible for all that happens. They contend that nothing happens outside God's will, because this helps them address the hard question of why certain things happen, and because it also honors a biblical term like predestination. It seems like the best answer. But we must acknowledge that very few of Calvin's contemporaries and few since embrace the idea of complete and total predestination. Most all Christian thinkers believe that humans bear some responsibility for their actions. If that's the case, then how does it fit with predestination? Well, old professor and chaplain from years ago had a very good way of explaining God's will, our will, and even predestination. He said it's like sending your 18-year-old daughter on a flight traveling from Nashville to Boston to visit grandparents. Boston is her destination, but her flight has a connection in Atlanta. Well, Atlanta's experiencing weather delays, and so she's diverted to Minneapolis. Then, because of bad weather, she is sent to Chicago. Finally, in Chicago, bad weather delays all flights, so she's invited to spend the night in the terminal. She decides instead to get a rental car and drive to Boston. After she sees that Boston is 15 hours away, she decides to drive 7 hours back home to Nashville. Boston was her predestination, what her loving parent had bought tickets for, what she was predestined for. But because of unfortunate circumstances and because of her choices, that destination failed to become a reality. So the bottom line is that we Wesleyans embrace God's sovereignty over all creation. We embrace God's gift of allowing humans to choose. We embrace our human responsibility for our actions. And we embrace that God has predestined us for our very best and for His very best in all creation. So we live out our faith. We cling tightly to the promise of Romans 8:28. All things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to His purposes. The New Testament is not promising that everything which happens will be good. Not that everything which happens is God's doing, but it is promised that anything which happens, even something as rampant and pervasive as COVID-19, even something as bad as the worst war or the most overwhelming natural disaster, No matter how bad it is, God can reach into that situation and bring about good. Ultimately, that is a New Testament promise to us, and we can live out our faith every day.
I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk. Let me walk close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. When my feeble life is o'er, time will be for me no more. Guide me to that peaceful shore. Let me walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be.